Hello everyone. Um, I'll be talking about GDP, the gross domestic product today, and it has a significant effect in the lives of many, and countries use that to measure the standard of living within the country, maybe over years, and measure the standard of living within different countries. What is GDP? GDP is the gross domestic product, and it is the market value of the final goods and services produced within a country at a specified time. And what constitutes GDP are those goods and services produced within a country. For instance, companies in the US that produce goods within here, those goods and services are considered part of GDP for the US. Now, if a US company produces goods out of the US, those goods are not considered part of the US's GDP. Also, if a Chinese company such as Toyota produces goods in the US, those goods are considered part of the US GDP. Now, the GDP can be calculated using two approaches, talking about the expenditure approach and the income approach. And let's begin with the expenditure approach. The expenditure approach calculates GDP as such. You add the consumer expenditure, government expenditure, investments, and the next exports. But let's define those terms. Consumer expenditure are those expenditure by households, the purchase of goods and services by households for household consumptions. Now let's represent that with a C. And then investments are those just the purchase of equipment, tools and equipment that we use to produce those goods and services. That label uses to produce those goods and services, and it includes additions to inventory. Also, we have government expenditure, and that's government spending at all levels of government, whether federal, state, or local governments. And lastly, we have net export, which is just the not the sum, it is the market value of net exports minus net imports, and that value could be negative. When the imports are more than the exports, means the government is spending more, the country is spending more money. As a result, money is going out. But when there are more imports, means the government is making more money, is profiting out of exports. So obviously that would be a positive value. So if you add all those values, the government expenditure, consumer expenditure, investments, and net exports, that will give you the GDP for a country at a specified time. Now, talking about the income approach, usually the income approach is used to measure or check the accuracy of the value of GDP calculator using the expenditure approach. But the little difference is called the statistical discrepancy, and that can be used by a country to judge what they're doing wrong, what they're doing right, what they aren't measuring, what they are measuring, or what they are missing, and then might put together systems to make up for that. Now, for the income approach, it's caused by, first of all, considering the net domestic product, which is a summation of all the various payments made to the factors of production. I'm talking about wages for labor, rent for land, interest for capital, goods and services, and then the profits paid to the entrepreneurs. This make up the net domestic product, and to those which is obviously income, to these various factors of production, we add back the indirect taxes, less subsidiaries, which will make up the complete income. And then to that as well, we add depreciation. Now, depreciation is just those costs related just costs as a result of capital depletion. And to depreciation, once you add depreciation, you get the GDP that comes from the income approach. But now the little difference is that you get is called statistical discrepancy, and if you add that to the GDP from the income approach, you get a GDP from the expenditure approach, and that's how you calculate GDP. But I do know the expenditure approach is most often used by the Bureau. I think it's the Bureau of Level and is it Bureau of Level Statistics? I think so. Yeah, I think it's most often used. Now let's keep in mind, we know what GDP is, which is the market value of final goods and services produced within the country. But then real GDP, what is real GDP? Now there's that GDP calculated with respect to a base year, but then adjusted for inflation. While nominal GDP, on the other hand, is GDP calculated in current year prices or current year market value, for instance. And then real GDP per person is just the real GDP, which is inflation adjusted divided by the population at that time to give you real GDP per person, and that is also called the standard of living, maybe of the country, and that can be used to measure a standard of living within the country for a year, and with different countries as well. Now, also want you to keep in mind this term potential GDP, because potential GDP is real what real GDP can become if at full production capacity, if all the factors of production are used to its maximum. That's what potential GDP is. Keeping that in mind, let's talk about the business cycle and how GDP is affected within the business cycle. When there is a recession, everything falling back, production falling back, maybe less expected profits are expected to be less, maybe high interest rates. Real GDP falls, this living standard falls, that real GDP falls, real GDP per person falls, living standards fall, and as the fall keeps going down, the peak of that fall is called the trough. But then when a company starts doing good, maybe low interest rates, high standards of living, high GDP, high consumption of goods and services, high government spending, high levels of investments, and high value that comes from net exports, the real GDP increases, and it gets closer to potential GDP as far as the practice of production are being used to its maximum. And as that happens, the peak of that height and the peak of that increase is called the highest point of that increase is called a peak. And that's what happens during a recession and an expansion. Meanwhile, there are goods and services which could have been, but are omitted from real GDP or omitted from the calculation of GDP. Let's consider a few of those. First, let's begin with household production. These are goods produced within the household for the consumption of that household, and those are not documented, those are not seen out of that household, so those are not included in real GDP. But yes, there are goods and services produced within the country. Also, we talk about underground production. Now, you've heard of the mafia, you've probably watched The Godfather, and you know there was probably a lot of underground production going on, production of maybe sugarcane and stuff like that. But that is hidden from the government as such. The government cannot put a tax on it, they cannot put a hand on it, they cannot quite pinpoint it as such. It's not included in the country's GDP. Also, we talk about leisure time. Now, these are goods and services which we can't really put a value, but it influences the standard of living, but yet not included in GDP. And lastly, we have environmental quality. Now, though GDP might be as high as it could be for a country, if there are polluted streams, depleted forests, that's a high level of CO2 in the atmosphere. That's a high level of environmental pollution. And if a country has to deal with this, even though they have a higher GDP, that is also considered part of the living standard. That reduces or lowers their living standards, but yet it's not considered in GDP. Let's and two more of those political freedom and one of which is political freedom and social injustice. Though a company like China might have an increasing continuously high levels of GDP or high amounts of real GDP per person, and standards of living are increasing, people would rather trade economic interest with political freedom, because they want that freedom to make decisions, they want that freedom to trade, but they do not have that complete freedom as they wish to, and that also influences the standard of living. And lastly, we have health. I think it's health and safety, health and quality of living. Yes, standard of living will also increase as real GDP increases. As a company enters expansion, real GDP increases. But we see there are usually pandemics and breakouts, such as the flu, AIDS, and for Africa, I'll call malaria, for instance. Now, that reduces the population. That also affects the standard of living, but it's not included in the calculation of real GDP. Having said that, I'd like to say thank you, and everyone have a great day. Bye.